this move in the bond market, so many commentators, again, the losing mainstream media because they can't get it right. They're just pushing their agenda. They're getting it wrong. The idea that bond yields are up because this is going to be a disaster just does not comport with the realities of the situation. You would not expect a strong dollar. You would not expect equities to do well, particularly financials, which benefited, tremendously off of this.
It's a
So,
re-rating of growth. That's all it is.
the
Anyone with a
great
brain
growth
understands.
re-rate. Yep, the great growth
Yeah,
re-rate.
it's re-rating of growth. I mean, that's all this is. If it was so bad, then why are stocks going up? So
Yeah.
this is a re-rating. And actually, by the way, to his credit, Powell was asked about this, and he agrees with us.
Welcome to RenMac Off Script. We'll discuss markets, economics, policy, history, and life. It's the 8th of November, 2024. I'm Jeff DeGraff.
I'm Neil Dutta.
And Steve Powell.
We're going to touch on, obviously, the election, the Fed meeting this week, what the implications were, the market's reaction, and how we're seeing things. RenMacAccess.com, if you're not an institutional investor, can get some of our insights to that. Neil, did you leave prior to the election? Is that your concerns? You're getting out of Dodge, or where are you exactly?
I mean, no, I voted, and then I left on Wednesday.
So you Molotov cocktailed it, and then you hit the road.
I mean, I made a gamble that I was like, well, if I leave on Wednesday, the likelihood is that the cash in my wallet will take on more value when I get to where I'm going. So,
Fair,
you know,
like a true economist. Uh, Steve, obviously, a big week in your world. Let's talk a little bit about what exactly happened, and probably more. Let's not talk about so much what happened. Let's talk about what we should expect going forward. So, obviously, you were a member. I don't know if it's obvious that people know this. You were a former Trump transition team member, so you've kind of seen probably as much chaos as anybody. But from not only your experience, but where your seat right now, knowing kind of who the players are, what do you expect between now and inauguration with the new administration? What are some of the key points?
Well, sure. I mean, I think the big thing to take away is compared to my role last time 8 years ago in doing the personnel, I think it's going to be a much smoother transition this time. I think that's sort of obvious, although it's sort of judged by a relatively low bar. That said, we've already seen Trump announce Susie Wiles, who was his campaign chair, as his chief of staff. That came out yesterday evening, Thursday, depending on when you're listening to this. And I think that is indicative that the process is going to be smoother. It's going to be faster this time. Usually that's the first domino that needs to fall. And then my guess is at that point, we're going to get some probably over the weekend, early next week, announcement of some other key White House staff. And I think you're going to start to see names sort of being floated more seriously for the cabinet position jobs. And if you're thinking of a timeline, sort of, names want to get probably 50 or so high-ranking cabinet positions, most senior positions there in the White House to get through those key agencies. The goal is probably to do that by the end of November, early December. And then you start looking at what that timeline is for confirmation for some of those Senate positions. Usually that's end of February at the earliest, from the real key positions like Treasury and State in particular. And then Kurt drags out to March or April. I think that's important because one of the questions we got a lot this week in New York with clients was sort of a tariff timeline. And I sort of look at that as if you're going to have people in place at Commerce, which does Section 232 tariffs, and USTR, which does the Section 301 tariffs. Those both require investigations, last about 30 days or so. So I don't think the conclusion of the investigation is in doubt. But I think that sort of really kicks off the potential negotiation with the countries of concern. So that's where I sort of view it as more of a mid-year event. But the wild card there may be IEPA. It's a presidential authority. It's never been used recently for tariffs, but with Trump, anything's possible. But I think I'd be surprised if he wanted to proceed that early with that aggressively. I think what he's more likely to got questioned sort of like day one is that's when the deregulatory agenda items start. You can actually elevate people in certain commissions like SEC, CFP already, just to sort of stop the direction where some of the regulations were headed and actually begin the clock. It's going to take longer maybe than people are thinking to start some of the deregulatory stuff. But I think initiating that day one, a lot of questions on immigration. My sense is that Trump's going to reinstate just a lot of the policies regarding immigration that Biden rolled back. I am more skeptical that he's going to follow through on the mass deportation effect just because of the resources wouldn't be required are just so significant. I just don't know that it's practical. That's sort of how I'm thinking about it. And then, watch the names. Personnel is policy. I think, when you start to see people like maybe reemergence of Bob Lighthizer at USTR, I think that's a pretty good indication of where maybe headed on the tariff front. With respect to Treasury, two of the names publicly being out there, John Paulson, Scott Bessent. Both of them have been very vocally supportive of Trump's aggressive trade position with respect to tariffs. I think that's notable because usually it's the role of the trade secretary or the Treasury secretary sort of push back on tariffs. You've seen Janet Yellen do that, Stephen Mnuchin, who I worked for, do that as well. So if there's more alignment here, that's something to consider when you're trying to assess how likely are these things to come to fruition.
And just as a matter of real world versus theoretical and chalkboarding this, is there anything from a grievance standpoint that Democrats can do, or particularly the Biden administration between here and the inauguration to kind of foil the plans, or at least put them on a political where, in other words, an executive action that if Trump came in and zinged it out would be would look bad politically. I mean, do they not tend to do that, or is there enough animosity between these two factions that, who knows?
They have a thing called the Congressional Review Act. So, the new incoming Congress, the fact that you're going to have a Republican sweep, Republicans Trump with the House and Senate means that they could, go ahead and roll back those. Obviously, anything done with executive action can be undone. Talked about elevating some of those folks and the key regulatory agencies. So, I would be very skeptical that even if anything's announced here at the end, that there's really much that would be durable. And I think they probably know that. I also think that one thing you might try to see is sort of respect to the Inflation Reduction Act could be a more desire to get a lot of those funds out the door, make less of an opportunity for Trump and Republicans to really try to reclaim those. Another question we got a lot in New York. And, I think when it comes to the campaign promise of trying to reclaim, repurpose Inflation Reduction Act funds that have been unspent, I'm a little skeptical there. I think there's probably going to be less of a sledgehammer, more of a scalpel. There are some provisions that Republicans and some of their key constituents actually support, and even just trying to reclaim the funds. That was something that Republicans tried to do with COVID. It's difficult to get the money back from the states. A lot of the funds, I suspect, are at currently. So that's something I'd watch. And then one thing to consider with Biden, I don't want to get too conspiratorial here, but I will, is there's been a lot of talk about Jack Smith, the special counsel, winding down the investigations into Trump. And there's some speculation that it may not be coincidental that maybe Biden's looking to pardon his son before he exits the door. And by sort of pairing that with withdrawing the lawsuits against Trump, that Trump will be less likely to criticize him. I just mentioned that because of that. There's a merit to that. I don't know why Trump, or Biden rather, would try to antagonize the incoming Trump administration if he's sensitive to that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, I think for the IRA and CHIPS Act money, the idea that they're gonna move the money out the door faster seems kind of odd to me, because one of the initial reasons they did it the way they did in terms of the geographic distribution was to try to make inroads in I guess you could say Republican states, red states, and clearly that didn't work.
Oh, well,
Right?
well, that's one theory. Another theory is that a lot of those happen to be right to work states, and that despite Biden's pro-union rhetoric, when it came to actually getting it done economically and quickly, that doing it in areas that aren't that are
I mean, I think politically they were making a gamble that through sort of increased subsidies to these states, maybe they could get some of the voters, and who knows? I mean, but clear. I mean, I don't I mean, at this point, it's like maybe out of spite they don't get the money out faster.
perhaps.
So if you look, just, this will be our only retrospective. what do you think Harris's Achilles heel was? And in the end, if you can just summarize it, I mean, clearly when you look at the electorate, right? I mean, everything, and we published this chart, and you can see when they break down the electorate, the point being that Hispanics have a much better sense of humor than mainstream media, obviously, right? Because they voted overwhelmingly in his direction. So, what do you think the breakdown was when you look at the Achilles heel of the Harris campaign versus the Trump campaign?
One thing I'd maybe lead into Neil's world a little bit is just talk about the economy and most people defining how they judge the economy on the prices they're paying for goods. And if you just look at elections beyond the U.S., inflation has been a global phenomenon, something Fed Chair Jerome Powell's talked about, and a lot of the parties in power have been punished as a result of that, respective whether the right or left. So I think part of it was just being in that environment. You could argue maybe they contributed to that environment, but and that's something we've seen globally. Something that maybe the Trump team did well. It may not have been Trump. I think it was Greg Abbott, Texas, highlighting this issue of immigration when the Texas governor started sort of forcing the issue by busing migrants to other areas that created greater awareness as opposed to when it was really just concentrated in Texas, Arizona, and Southern California prior to that. So I think when you look at the issue areas that were of concern to voters, that may have helped elevate the concern of immigration there. Technically for Trump, I think there was a lot of concern at the time. It looked like a risky bet. Obviously, it paid off, relying on young male voters and going to speak directly to them in the form of the podcast. And not having that media filter may have given opportunity to connect more there. And then relying on Elon Musk and others for this get out the vote operation. A little risky, hadn't really had experience in that. Turned out to work well enough. In terms of what Harris maybe strategically could have done different, I mean, part of it, I think she was dealt a bad hand just because Biden's insistent maybe to stay in the race, as opposed to, I think the more logical time to leave would have been after the midterms in 22. At the end of the day, you look at Biden's approval ratings and his favorability ratings. She, as the vice president, was tied to that. She, in my opinion, never really articulated how she would be different, even though she was given ample opportunity to express that. And so I think all these things sort of contributed to the results that we saw. Just leave it.
I think I can do it in one word. I think it was authenticity. I think you look at Harris, and I'm sure she's a sweet and somebody who you'd like to have a glass of wine with, I guess in her case. But I don't think she came across as authentic, right? I don't think she came across as having her own ideas. Didn't have, they were all kind of, it was all kind of part of the machine, right? And Trump, whether you love him or hate him, I mean, it's authentic. Like the stuff he says is authentic. There's no script, obviously, but so in a way, if you're sitting there wondering, like, what way is this policy going to go? Do you trust the person who's inauthentic, and not because they're a bad person, but just because you don't really know what their North Star is? Or do you trust the person who has authenticity, even though he might be a little nuts? How do you think about that? I mean, that really, I think when
She was the
you're looking at
incumbent. She was the incumbent. That's all it is. She was the incumbent. Every
I,
incumbent all over the world is going down, whether they're liberal or conservative. Rishi Sunak. I mean, Trudeau's like walking dead right now up in Canada. The Germans are just calling a snap election because their government just collapsed. So she was the incumbent, and Trump was able. I mean, that's why it was so important for them to try to run this strategy of making it seem like Trump was president for the last 4 years when in fact he wasn't. So they were unsuccessful in doing that because people aren't stupid. And so, I mean, if anything, I mean, if you grade it on a curve, she was a reasonably strong candidate, all things considered, right? So, it wasn't so much that she lost; it was that she lost by maybe not as much as a lot of other incumbents have lost by. So
I'll tell you
that
who
would be
the big loser, mainstream media. I mean,
100%.
huge loser. And not only that, I was watching Mark Halperin on election night, right? I had CNBC and MSNBC and CNN up, and I'm listening to Mark Halperin. He had a podcast going. These guys had it called. Sean Spicer and a Democratic operative, Dan, somebody I can't think of his name. My apologies, Dan, because you're good. But they had the election called by 8. I mean, CNN is John King is trying to figure out what's going on the big magic board, right? And Wolf Blitzer is out to lunch. I mean, he doesn't have a clue. But these guys had it called. I mean, they're talking about how the people within the parties are making excuses, and others are. I mean, they're just like, it was clear by 8 o'clock. I mean, that it was over, and you could see it again. Let's
Betting
go back to
market,
this
right?
because we talked about this. It was clear in the betting markets, right? The poly market started to move very, very quickly, well before what you were seeing from mainstream media. And again, in defense of free markets, in defense of the invisible hand, not the perceived Elon Musk visible hand, the invisible hand got it right. And it did it because, again, it's a zero-sum game. If one's going to win, somebody has to lose, and that creates value on one side, or it creates overvalue on the other
And
side.
also,
So
people are more likely to be truthful with their own money than they are to a pollster.
can you imagine? Can you imagine?
I would recommend that everyone go and look at the tweets of Richie Torres on the issue. He's a Democrat from, I think, the Bronx. And he basically is a strong proponent of the sort of political prediction markets.
So
At
you're
any rate,
saying he
let's
knows
move
he
on to
knows
the Fed.
he knows he knows a staircase dice game as well as anybody. We'll go on to the Fed. So look, the um, the Fed obviously had their meeting. Does Powell keep his job? I mean, he's going to keep it. He gets to. But what do you think what do you think he thinks of his new former boss?
I think he would disagree with the premise of that statement, Jeff. That's not his boss.
Right. Fair.
Not permitted under the law. Not permitted under the law.
That's his
So,
interpretation.
well, I mean, he talked to the Fed's lawyers. At
Well,
any rate,
the new White House lawyers may take a different view, but
I mean, look, I mean, the biggest risk to the economy from Trump's uh, views isn't tariffs, isn't deficit spending. It's threatening the independence of the Fed. You want to crush the bond market? Have at it. And Trump is a markets guy who talks about feeling the markets. I think he'd be very reluctant to do that if he saw what was happening to the bond market, if he tried to threaten the independence of the Federal Reserve. So, I've argued that, sort of borrowing from our friend Scott Bessent's idea, instead of trying to nominate someone early, what they could do is Trump can apply the logic that he applied with the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court nominees, to the Fed. Just put out a list of potential replacements for Jerome Powell. Here's a list. It could be Kevin Hassett, Warsh, Governor Waller, maybe Mickey Bauman. Put up a bunch of people and have the markets do the vetting for you. And that's it's a way of sort of having a sort of public vetting process on the issue. Now, for his part, I thought Jerome Powell basically struck all the right notes. I mean, he didn't really say that the election is going to determine anything around near-term policy. Obviously, the implication of that is that, as we get towards next year and the policy starts coming more into focus, things can change, but that's what should happen. But I do think that, I didn't really see any evidence in anything he said this week that would put a December skip in play. He talked about the general easing of the labor market. I thought it was pretty encouraging that they didn't really call out hurricanes and the Boeing strike as a reason for the slowing in the job market. I think that's notable. And so, I think on net, it was a dovish day. I made a joke to a couple of friends of mine. I was like, look, this sounds like someone who might get nominated by Donald Trump. Oh, and by the way, he already has been once. So, look, I think it's there's like I said, I mean, if I was an advisor to the president, I don't think he'd be doing himself any favors by trying to get rid of Powell, which is why I think, some of the people out there are probably telling him to not do that. They're trying to come up with ways to work around that, nominate someone earlier, as I mentioned. So,
Do you put do you put the list on Poly Market? Let the market betting markets tell you who you should nominate.
Why not? Why not? I mean, that would be a great idea. I mean, and also like it's almost like a way of like increasing the forward guidance in the marketplace, right? Like he's already said that Powell is gone. So at some level, maybe that increases his independence between now and 2026. He's sort of unencumbered, right? At the same time, you can put out a list of nominees and present it to the public and have the market do the vetting for you. So, I don't know. And for the I think for the economy, I mean, if just keeping it on the fundamentals, the Fed's doing the right thing, right? I mean, the job openings rate is down, quits rates are down, recruiting intensity is low, right? I mean, they're talking about they don't welcome any additional cooling in the job market. And Powell even said this week that policy is still restrictive even after they cut. So I think that that's important. So it tells me that they're not done yet. So I would be leaning against the idea that they'd be skipping in December. Obviously, the data is going to dictate everything, and I think that's important because it's much more important to kind of respond to what you see as opposed to speculate on what you can't. And speculating on potential fiscal outcomes would be, I think, a big mistake on the Fed's part because no one really knows yet what's exactly is going to happen. And that's what the markets do, right? They speculate, right? The Fed can't always do that.
Indeed. Well, what the market was speculating before the election, right, was a Trump victory. And you could see it. So it wasn't just the poly markets. I mean, we talked about Fannie Mae here. Fannie Mae is almost a double since we talked about it, right? And that's why these things are important because you can glean, put your political philosophical differences to the side, your ideology aside. You want to look at the markets through a fresh lens. And, oftentimes it's not about ideology. It's just about, where is there a mismatch? Where can I take advantage of this? So one of the things that we talked about was equity volatility. The VIX was high while credit spreads were option adjusted credit spreads remained low. And that residual, that differential, historically is not unusual before an election. But in each time, it tends to contract where the volatility comes in. And the volatility from equities tends to come in because guess what? Equities rally, right? And equities figured it out. Now, on Tuesday, we saw that 88% of the Russell 3000, that's a big deal because the Russell 3000 is obviously much bigger than the S&P 500. 88% of the names closed up on the day, right? Every single sector was positive on the day. This is before the polls closed, right? I mean, you still had 3 hours until the quickest poll closing. So the markets got it right. The markets figured it out, and I think that's really really important. Now, for those out there who are apoplectic about the results, I think it's also important to look when we look at unified government, whether it's from the R side or it's from the D side, the results are almost exactly the same. Statistically, it doesn't make any difference. It's actually good for both. So I get it. I understand that there's a lot of concern out there, a lot of trepidation. But one thing that we've talked about, Neil, and I want to get your opinion on this, is this move in the bond market. So many commentators, again, the losing mainstream media because they can't get it right. They're just pushing their agenda. They're getting it wrong. The idea that bond yields are up because this is going to be a disaster just does not comport with the realities of the situation. You would not expect a strong dollar. You would not expect equities to do well, particularly financials, which benefited, tremendously off of this. So
it's a re-rating of growth. That's all it is. Anyone
the
with a
great
brain
growth
understands.
re-rate. Yep, the great growth
Yeah,
re-rate.
it's re-rating of growth. I mean, that's all this is. If it was so bad, then why are stocks going up? So
Yeah.
this is a re-rating, and actually, by the way, to his credit, Powell was asked about this, and he agrees with us, right? I mean, he basically said this is not really about inflation expectations insofar as it's more about fading downside risks than a re-rating of the real growth expectations.
Right.
So I think that's important. He was basically he like highlighted the 5-year forward inflation break-even rate. It's not there. So I think this is about stronger growth. Look at the stock market. That's what this is about. So yeah, it's just a sign of increased confidence. Look, the media was doing the same thing in 2016.
100%.
So look, I mean,
If you want to make money, they have no credibility. If you want, if you want to listen to pandering, pander. If you want to make money, listen to us. I mean, it really is going that way. The mainstream media is losing it in terms of just letting their ideology dominate
and that's
the
why we
facts.
call them, gentlemen, fake news, right? I mean, fake news isn't so much what people think it is. It's when you try to present an opinion as reality.
Yes.
And that's what they've been doing for the better part of the last Gosh, 8, 9 years.
Yep. So if you're worried about inflation, one thing to watch, and that's why the beauty of this is you would expect credit spreads to contract, right? Because the ability to pay back those debts is better, right? And we're seeing that. The triple B spreads are at a new cycle low versus treasuries. However, that being an inflation problem, as Powell mentioned, would also show itself in financials. And financials tend to absolutely get dismantled under an inflationary regime, a persistent inflationary regime. And I just don't think that the market is sending a message like that. It is absolutely sending a great growth re-rate, if nothing else. Neil, what do you have on the docket next week for data?
Well, two things are going to be getting attention. It'll be first the inflation data. CPI inflation's released, so we have CPI, PPI, so we'll get a good sense for the core PCE number that comes out later this month. And we will also be getting data on retail sales, I believe. I think that comes out on Friday.
And what's the cocktail of choice this weekend in your remote location that seems much warmer than the Northeast?
I mean, one of the few words I know in Spanish is margarita. So.
And it applies to pizza too, so you can go either way.
Exactly.
Pavlik, which what do we got this week for? I don't even know data. I mean, what happens this week for in your world? Tears.
Well, depending on your political preference.
Yeah.
I think what you're going to see, keep an eye on too. We're going to get any additional announcements here on the personnel front. Also, lawmakers are going to return for a 2-week session here for the lame duck session. One thing to keep an eye on: Senate Republicans will be having a leadership race to replace outgoing leader Mitch McConnell. Some jockeying there, and then also maybe try to get some insight as to what this lame duck agenda is going to be. There's some thought that maybe Trump may want Republicans to clear the deck, do fiscal year spending bills to get through September 30th next year, as opposed to what was proposed by Speaker Johnson prior to the election was another continuing resolution into March. That is something to keep an eye on. It's also possible that Trump may want to have them address the debt limit, which is set to, I guess, resurface here January 2nd. It's been suspended through January 1st. There's some school of thought that, by doing it now, do you really want these things to interfere with your first 100-day agenda? Maybe not, but that's sort of what I'm keeping an eye on.
Yeah. Well, we're going to continue to watch cyclicality. I think that's the mainstay from just a broad perspective. Think cyclicality. We're starting to see an uptick in software names. It's good news. We're actually seeing a downtick in semiconductor materials and equipment names like KLAC, AMAT, etc. Looking a little on a relative basis, looking weaker still. So we're focusing our efforts more on the software and equipment names, as we've talked about before. Then a big one will be discretionary. What happens to discretionary names? They've been relatively flat. You've had some winners and some losers, but we'd really like to see a nice breakout there that would certainly empower the cyclical trade versus the defensive trade as we go forward. So that is how we're thinking about it. S&P support at the 50-day moving average. So watch that as a bullish zone. And just as an aside, Bitcoin with a legitimate breakout now at a new high looks very good in this consolidation. Again, we're in the $90,000 camp as the next resistance point. So we'll continue to watch that. Remember, markets are complex, but good analysis doesn't have to be. Join us again next week. We'll be 1 week older, 1 week wiser. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and YouTube. Until then, I'm Jeff DeGraff.
I'm Neil Dutta.
And I'm Steve Pavlik.
We'll see you.